Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We will be starting shortly. Thank you for joining us this morning. We're just going to wait a couple more minutes for a few more to join. Thank you. Okay, I think that's given people enough time to join us. So let's get started. Hello and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this, the 8th of our Wednesday webinars. On behalf of the CLA, I am delighted to welcome you to what I'm sure will be an informative event. My name is Ann Maidment. I am the Regional Director for the Southwest, and I will be your chair for today's proceedings. We have 700 participants registered today, highlighting the importance of today's subject. My thanks go to our partners, Strutt and Parker and Barclays, who both have speaking roles today. Before introducing the speakers, a brief update from us here at the CLA. The COVID webpage is highly comprehensive, covering the breadth of government support and information our members need for all aspects of their business. There are 14 member-only briefings covering a wide range of topics, and we keep them updated as government advice changes. We would also encourage members to contact their regional office should they need support and advice. In terms of lobbying, as part of our roadmap to recovery, the CLA has published its paper, COVID-19, Restarting the Economy in Rural Areas. This is available via our website, and I would encourage you to take a look. Also, following significant pressure from the CLA and historic houses regarding outdoor ticketed attractions, as of yesterday, the government has now produced updated COVID-19 guidance to allow private gardens to open to the public. And although it may have seemed to some like the world is going nowhere fast right now, for farmers and landowners, it's business as usual. First cuts are well underway, markets are still running, and the farming calendar continues. But while 73,000 have submitted their BPS applications this year, with just a handful left to submit before the extended deadline finishes in June, thoughts turn to the future of farming and what support mechanisms might look like moving forward. And though the Agricultural Bill's third reading was dominated by the debate over food and animal welfare equivalents, the bill has passed the House of Commons and must now complete the same stages in the House of Lords. But let's not forget, we also have the Trade Bill with its second reading, and also the Environment Bill to come later in June. So plenty of opportunity to discuss transition arrangements, trade, and future markets. So what are those future markets? In today's session, we will explore the business of natural capital. Whilst I explain the format of today's event, to get an idea of the audience today, I would like to start by asking a poll. I'd like to see the engagement that we have on natural capital, to see how many of you are already doing something on your farm already. The format for this event is that I will ask our speakers 2 rounds of questions on the current position and future opportunities of natural capital. This will be followed by your questions, which I will pose to the panel on your behalf. Please do feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A button. Please restrict your questions to the session subject matter, otherwise approach the CLA for advice in a normal manner. So hopefully you've all been asking and answering the poll. So if we could just finish that poll. So interestingly, a small number have started receiving income from an environmental market, but the majority understand the concept and have not progressed it. Okay, moving on to the next slide. So the concept of natural capital, valuing environmental assets and processes, has gained increased prominence in the past 10 years and is continuing to do so, including as a foundational principle underpinning the new Environmental Land Management ELM scheme. So to ask a second poll, for those of you that have not progressed it, which seem to be the majority, I would like to ask what's holding you back. And I wondered if you could also answer this poll. One response to the environmental decline and threat of climate change has been to try and place an economic value on the environment and the benefits it produces. And this has encouraged businesses to value their environment properly in their business plans and decisions, and forms the basis for investment in environmental management from both public and private sectors. So it's a real opportunity. So if we could see the results of the progression poll, I might just give you another minute to just have a look at this one. So some of you are waiting to see what will happen in the ELM scheme, and there is still not enough clarity on the valuations. So some interesting results there. So moving on to the panel for today's event. We have some interesting speakers today, and I should remind you that today's session is being recorded for future use, including availability to other members. And it will be on the website and available for you to have another look later on. Just to remind you, please feel free to ask questions at any time using the Q&A button. I will now move on to the first round of questions. So to start with, I would like to get a flavour of the work that each organisation and member are doing at the moment in this area. And I'm going to start by asking Jason Beedell from Strutt & Parker. Jason, what are Strutt & Parker currently doing in this area, and what do your clients want to know?
Thanks, Anne. Most clients want to know what have I got, what can I do, what the potential is from my land, and how much is it worth. So rather echoing the findings from the second poll. And to answer those kind of questions, we think you need to quantify the natural capital that you've got in a robust, repeatable way, and also, really importantly, in a way that governments and markets will recognise. You don't want to do something and then find that it's not in quite the right format. And you can do that with natural capital accounts. And we did it because I think we've understood the theory for a while, but we wanted to see something practical for a client's estate called Clifton Castle in Yorkshire. And we did it with our collaborator, FTech. And the aim of that exercise was to produce a practical set of accounts that answers those three questions. What have I got? What can I do? How much is it worth? And you can do the same exercise for smaller farms and estates. And what I've got here is an example for a much smaller farm. This is the kind of baseline account that you can produce. So starting on the left-hand side, you start with a list of all the farm's activities, and from that you produce a physical flow account. That's the yellow vertical oval, and that shows the quantity of the benefits from the farm. And in this farm, if you're very quick at maths, you can see that the farm is a net emitter of carbon, which is typical. And then you can use these figures to produce a monetary flow account on the right-hand side. So you start to put pounds figures against everything, which shows the value of the benefits. And at the bottom, the cost of producing them, the maintenance costs. And in this example, you can see that most of the benefits are in hand or to the tenant, mainly from profits from farming. And the public costs on the far right-hand side are mainly costs in terms of emissions of about £18,000, so about a quarter of the value of the profits. So this allows you to quantify the financial and environmental costs and benefits, and of course, some social ones. We also modelled what the potential of the land is from, what the potential from the land is. And you can see that on this slide for our example farm. What we did was loosely base our future scenario on the kind of changes recommended in the Committee on Climate Change's first report on land use. And they're often the kind of changes discussed by policymakers too. What clients want, though, is a really practical assessment of what's possible. So we really critically challenged all of the proposed changes, in this case with our agronomy and farm management team, so that we knew they were possible and practical for individual farms. And that's given everyone much more confidence that what is being proposed can actually be developed. We then fed these models, and you can see them, into our model so you can compare it with the baseline account, which you've got on this slide. This step's really important. It produces the robust data on change that I think land managers are going to need if they're going to engage in environmental markets. The future account, so on the right-hand side, shows the potential to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and you can see that through the figures, with a small reduction in revenues from food production. You can see that right at the top of the slide of the balance sheet. And in this case, the farm switched from being a net emitter to a net storer of carbon. That's not shown here, but there is a physical flow account that goes with this financial account. So, Anne, I think these kind of accounts have got three practical uses. Firstly, the farm can express its impact on the environment in physical and monetary terms, which is very important. Secondly, it's got a practical future vision for its land use, tested by an agronomist, and that can be used to write a land management plan on what changes to make when, and what effect they're going to have on the farm financially and physically. And then finally, if you know the amount of environmental outputs that can be generated and potentially traded, it puts the farm in a much stronger position to actually engage in those markets.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you, Jason. So I'm now going to turn to Barclays and to Oliver. Oliver, are Barclays taking natural capital seriously as something which impacts how banking operates in rural areas?
Hi, morning, Anne. Morning, everybody. Yes, clearly we are taking natural capital very seriously. Prior to March, it felt like every other conversation internally and externally was about natural capital, and some of the things that have been touched on already as to, what is it? How do we quantify it? What have I got? What can I gain? We do, as a large sort of transatlantic corporation, we have corporate and social responsibility internally for what we're doing about natural capital, but we also have a sort of rural business responsibility to our client base, which sort of numbers 26% of UK farmers, to keep it high on the agenda. So it's high on the agenda internally, it's high on the agenda externally. We are getting asked questions what our policies and risk policies are to do mainly with climate change, which is obviously connected to natural capital and its worth. But also we're having a lot of conversations with our clients about it. We do seem to be, agriculture seems to be a sector that's sort of almost tossed around a little bit on a sea of policy. I'm nearly old enough to remember the Farm Improvement Grant Scheme, which paid to drain peat uplands in the sort of 70s and early 80s. And then, of course, 20 years later, countryside stewardship comes in and actually pays to re-wet those areas. But I think for me at the moment, climate change, carbon sequestration, and natural capital seem to be an absolute firm, dead set direction of travel. So for us as a bank, whether it's a farming improvement scheme, whether it's an efficiency scheme, whether it's stewardship, ELS, HLS, and all the other guises of stewardship, we as a bank have been taking those sort of different income streams into account when we're looking at debt service, when we're looking at lending responsibly, and we'll continue to do so. Whether that income line comes via ELMS for natural capital or whether it comes via carbon sequestration. I think for a lot of people feeling like it's a bit of a disruption in the industry, but we must remember from disruption comes opportunity. Farmers, landowners, the supply chain, the processors, we have that corporate, social and environmental responsibility, but also, we've got to remember 25% of the UK, European and world population are millennials. Well, if you're ancient and old like I am, you're a Generation X. In our generation, we measure ourselves on our houses, our cars. The millennial generation have done a lot of research on this. They measure themselves by their lifestyle. And for them, food equals lifestyle equals image. There was a very interesting survey at Oxford Farming Conference a couple of years ago. They asked a group of millennials if they wanted GM products in their diet, and around 75% said they didn't. They also asked the same group if they wanted DNA in their diet, which, as we all know, is the building blocks for plant and animal life, and 74% said they didn't want DNA in their diet. So we've got to get out there and educate and explain what all this is. But for me, if we can have a farm, and we'll hear from the other speakers later on, and I'm sure it'll come out in Q&A, but if I could get to a point where my product, whether it's beef or beans, lamb or lentils, whether it's an attraction, a country walk, a country house attraction, if you get to the point where that's a net zero product, that's something that is going to appeal to 25% of global population. Tying to that, there's an EU report that said greenhouse gas emissions from air travel between 1990 and 2006 went up 86%. There are a lot of corporate organisations out there that are going to be looking to offset. Tying that unique product of net zero, tying that sequestration into the corporate world, and you've got a real opportunity for income generation. We're moving at pace now, and Barclays wants to be part of that.
Great, thank you, Oliver. Okay, we're now going to move on to the CLA and to Harry Greenfield. Harry, What is the CLA doing to engage members with the concept of natural capital?
Morning, Anne. Morning, everyone. Yeah, well, I think the CLA is taking this very seriously, and I think we're trying to talk more about this with our members. I think the basic way that I've been thinking about natural capital and the CLA has is it's perhaps a new way of thinking about quite an old concept. So it's basically about how you value the assets within your business, how you look at the potential to add value to them through the way you manage those assets, and then looking for markets for them. This is fairly standard for how any business might operate. I think the difference between natural capital is that it's based on the environmental values of the land, and it's based on environmental outputs, environmental goods and services, which historically haven't had a market for them. But this is quickly starting to change, and some of the other panelists have already mentioned. I think that people are starting to realise that this value exists, and that the environmental benefits produced from well-managed natural capital do have a value, and that some of that value can be monetised. So it's important to start thinking about it, and the CLA is trying to, as I say, engage our members, and also to try and sort of demystify some of this. I think that it can seem like quite a complicated concept, perhaps, and it's maybe not sort of practical yet, or not seen as very practical at the moment. So we're trying to help people to understand it, but also to demystify some of the terms involved. Although, I mean, as Jason has set out, some of the underlying valuation, for example, is quite technical, but the basic idea should be fairly straightforward. And then in terms of why this is happening, I mean, it's already been mentioned, but I think that, you know, the reason this is moving at pace at the moment is that the number and type of people who are willing to start thinking, at least, about paying for natural capital is rapidly increasing. So we've got the government, as you mentioned at the beginning, and the new environmental land management scheme that's going to be the backbone of new agricultural policy in England, is essentially the government paying for natural capital, or paying for land managers and farmers to manage their natural capital well, due to the public goods, the benefits that this produces for the whole of society. We've also got biodiversity net gain, which is being introduced through the Environment Bill, and this will require developers in the future to essentially pay to offset the harm that they do to natural capital. It may not be phrased in those exact terms, but that's essentially what it is. And they, so if a developer causes damage or destroys some wildlife habitat in the course of producing a housing development, they'll have to pay to recreate that habitat. Water companies is another example that this has been going for some time, actually, but essentially water companies might have an interest in paying for land to be managed in a particular way that produces cleaner water. And again, this is an example of paying for natural capital to be managed in a certain way. And sticking to the water theme, flooding, which we're likely to see quite an increase of due to climate change. And so businesses that are at risk of flooding, or those that insure those businesses, are starting to think about, is there a way of managing land, for example, upstream in a catchment, in a way that reduces flood risk. We've also got examples from the supply chain. So consumers might be willing to pay more for their food if they think it's produced in a way that protects or even enhances the environment, whether that's low carbon food or high nature food, organic or leaf are examples. And of course, carbon is a big driver. So climate change and the commitment to net zero from the government means that, you know, basically people are thinking a lot more about their carbon impact and the way to offset the carbon they produce. So something like the Woodland Carbon Code, which has been developed to give a standardized view of how much carbon is stored when you plant trees, and then you can produce carbon credits. And there are some more innovative ideas coming along as well. I think something like green prescribing, which recognizes the mounting evidence for the health, mental health and well-being value of being outside, being in nature, being in green spaces. And the health service is starting to take this seriously and starting to recommend or even prescribe people to spend more time outside, which could be a future source of income for the people who manage those outside spaces. And then finally, there's a whole load of things wrapped up in terms such as green finance, there's corporate investment. Some of these rely on the examples I previously outlined and, you know, related to climate change or flood risk. But there are a range of people thinking about how the finance sector can facilitate some of this and how corporate investment might both reduce some of the risks due to sort of poor environmental management or realize some of the opportunities from managing the environment well. So I think it just shows that this is coming from many different directions. Some of it's more developed than others, but it means that it's something that the CLA needs to be on top of. And it's something that we've been promoting for a long time. I think we first produced a report around a decade ago saying that there are lots of public environmental benefits that can be produced on private land, and that environmental markets or natural capital is the way to do that. So yeah, it's something we're doing quite a lot of work on.
Brilliant, thank you, Harry. So I'm now going to turn to Archie Ruggles-Brice, CLA member, to ask Archie, what have you been doing on the Spains Hall estate to start thinking about your own natural capital?
Thanks very much, Anne. It's great to be able to sort of explore this in detail with such a huge audience. We have a background of trying to do environmental works, and most recently we delivered a natural flood management project into which we installed leaky dams, man-made leaky dams, and also released beavers into an enclosure on the estate. And part of what I'm trying to do by harnessing the natural capital approach is to further integrate wider environmental benefits into the estate management, so the way we manage our land that we have. But also it's trying to shed a bit of light on how we assess the impact of the existing flood projects. So, you know, how do we tie up some of the benefits that we're trying to have for the local community in reducing their flood risk, but alongside all the other benefits that we are starting to see. And that in turn is going to shape our future estate plans. We've got lots of ideas as to other things we can do on the estate, but how do we make sure that they are the right things to do? And the natural capital approach is shedding a bit more light on that for us. It's also because we're trying to do some valuation in the same way that Jason outlined, it's going to help us build the business case for these sort of sustainable interventions. So, you know, how do we stack these up against, you know, necessary improvements to traditional built assets? And it will help us identify what needs safeguarding. So what's of value on the estate? So what are the things that actually are potentially deteriorating? How do we then gather the information to better understand those assets and perhaps do something about it? And finally, and very importantly, it's shedding visibility. It's allowing us a sight into what we might potentially be able to engage with on environmental markets. So just to show you the sort of the early stages, we haven't quite finished doing the work yet and working with the Environment Agency and Atkins on this. What we tried to do is take a very holistic approach, because one thing I'm always very concerned about is trying to focus on one particular outcome. So be that carbon, be that biodiversity, be that flood risk, whatever. What I would like to try and do, and what I'm using the natural capital approach to try and do, is to pull as many of these things together. And you'll see we've tried to include some of the more difficult things to value in this. So biodiversity is in there. And we've got, we've come up with a sort of an early figure of the overall annual value of ecosystem services to us as an estate and to the wider society is around about £740,000, and it's increasing by £140,000 a year. It's worth saying that this is modelling both the changes we've made. So we took our baseline before we made any changes a few years ago. It's valuing the changes we've already made in terms of the flood risk project, but also looking at a series of very detailed and planned interventions on the estate. So we're modelling things that we know we can do, and what we're using the natural capital approach to do now is to try and refine those designs. A couple of things to draw your attention to on that slide. So in the red ring, what's been really interesting for me is to understand and get a feel for the quantum of some of the negative impacts we are potentially having on the estate. So we're a farmed estate. We've got 2,000 acres, and the majority of that is arable cropping. We've got grade 2-3 arable land, so we're an important food producer. We've got about 10% woodland on there as well. But it means that we are losing soil to a certain extent. Now, certainly this is modelled outputs. This isn't measured outputs. It's worth saying that. And the values after the scheme have changed. So we have reduced our negative impacts. And this means that we can start looking at how we might be able to reduce those further, how we might be able to increase some of the positive impacts. So if you look at the chart at the bottom, we're forecasting an increase in the biodiversity provision on the estate, air quality, which is something that has come as a bit of a surprise, and carbon sequestration, and soil reduction, soil erosion risk. So we're trying to get a handle on these things, really. So really, the other thing to point out is that before going through this process, we thought we understood our land really well. You know, I'm a mapping geek. I love that sort of stuff. But by bringing in new data sets, we've been able to get a much better quantification of estate assets. So I knew we had about 80 hectares of woodland on the estate. I manage it. It's part of a woodland management plan. But what this new data set has allowed us to do is to actually quantify that we've got 26 hectares of hedges, which is just below 30% of our woodland cover. So, you know, we knew hedges were important. As a family, we've always tried to retain them on the estate, and I think we've done pretty well. However, they are that important, and now we can start to look at how we might manage those in a different way, perhaps, or better. We've also managed to quantify that we've got 19 hectares in flood zone 2, for example. So, you know, this is both a risk and an opportunity, potentially. It's a risk to us because a lot of that area is productive land, but also it's an opportunity. Perhaps this is a quantification, the early quantification of a benefit that we can deliver to wider society. The identification of risks and quantifying both the positive and negative environmental impacts, I can't stress enough, for us, it's been a really useful thing to do. Until that, we had no real concept of what the relative scale of ecosystem provision on our land was. So it's all very well taking sort of regional assessments to say that, you know, in East Anglia, it's, you know, water availability is a key ecosystem service. You know, what potential for those areas of land that we think we're going to be changing some sort of management practice on, what is the potential to influence that particular ecosystem service on that 4 hectare field, for example? And this is where it gets really interesting, because you can then start to tweak the designs of some of these things. So yeah, very quick overview. Happy to answer further questions. Over to you, Anne.
Brilliant. Thanks, Archie. So now that we've looked at what people are doing right now, we'd now like to move on to the future and the opportunities that might be there. Natural capital and the creation of markets for environmental goods and services is very much an emerging opportunity. So I'd like to ask each of the panel individually the question that's on your screen now. So I will start with Jason and ask, what is the most important thing that needs to happen now in order to embed natural capital as a concept and develop environmental markets? Jason.
For me, it's translating the really good national plans that we've got developed by the Committee on Climate Change, the Natural Capital Committee, into local plans. And I think we need to do that with land managers, not just have it imposed, but a bottom-up approach that's based on what's practical and what people feel that they can deliver. So I think lots of local accountability in that. And I think the second thing are demonstration farms. I know it's slightly old-fashioned and we've been there before for lots of other things, but exemplars, so land managers can come and see something locally that looks really good, that shows what's aiming to be achieved in an area, I think would be really effective. So, you know, show me, don't just tell me. And then the final thing is something that Lord Deben, the chair of the Natural Capital Committee on Climate Change, keeps saying, which is do it now, just get on with it. We've got plenty of plans, we've talked about it long enough.
Great, thank you. And Oliver, the same question to you.
Hi, Anne. Yeah, it's interesting. As a banker, former business consultant, the answers are going to be relatively simple from me. It's to quantify, to benchmark. You know, where are we getting these measurements from? and then to measure, have a good system of measuring. And by the looks of Jason and Archie, we're heading, the progress we've made down that route in the last 2 or 3 years is just amazing. And then probably where we would begin to get more involved is, accessing those markets. If it is carbon sequestration, and us looking at our product sets to see how we can play a part in that, which, we very much do. We want agriculture to be part of the solution to all these problems and all these tasks we've got to achieve. I did see one question, and it part of that sort of quantify thing. One question on the chat box there saying, are there benchmark figures? I saw something over the weekend. It was lamb 39 kilos of carbon per kilo, beef sat at 27, and almond milk at 0.125 kilos of carbon, presumably per litre. 90% of the world's almonds are grown in a drought area in California. I did some very rough calculations, and they are just my calculations, but it looks like about 368 gallons of water for a gallon of almond milk. I'm not being negative about almond milk. Everybody has different tastes, but I don't see how it can be 0.1 of a kilo of carbon to produce that when we're on all irrigated water. We just need some benchmarks, and we need some finite figures to work off. That's what banks like.
Of course. Thanks, Oliver. And Harry, if I could ask you the same question.
Yeah, I think it's keeping up the momentum, but not necessarily going so fast that you get things wrong. I think people need to have confidence. So I think some of what the government's doing is helpful. There will be a role for the government, partly because some of the benefits from natural capital are pure, public goods that it's unlikely that you'll ever be able to marketize properly. So something like wildlife biodiversity, it's quite hard to market this, so the government will have a role to play to pay for it, and that's what they're doing with some of the policies they're putting in place. I think the other role, and again the government can actually help on this, and they're doing some of this behind the scenes a little bit, although it's now published, with looking to develop some of these metrics or to point towards those people who've started to look at how to value some of these things. And that leads on to how the private sector can play a role. And partly that's about people realizing the benefits and the risks from how the environment's managed, how natural capital is managed. I think more and more people are doing this, but there's always going to be some first movers. But when the whole of a particular market realizes, or a particular sector of the economy realizes that there's a big risk or a big opportunity to be had, that will move things forward. And I think the risks are there for people to see, whether it's climate change or flooding or risks to the food supply chain. So people are starting to think differently. And I think that finally for farmers and land managers, I think that it's obviously now is definitely the time, I would say, to start taking these ideas seriously and to think about the value of your assets and the land that you manage. And that includes the natural capital value or the environmental value. It doesn't necessarily mean going the whole hog and doing a detailed natural capital account, although this can be useful, but at least having an idea of the kinds of things you might be able to do could lead to a lot of opportunities. The final thing, to echo what Jason said, we need more sort of proof of concept, more case studies and evidence to show that these things really do have value. I think some of that may require a bit of a mindset change. I think that people are used to seeing costs and benefits in a certain way and solutions in a certain way. So if you want to stop flooding, you build a concrete wall. If you want to produce food, you plough to the edge of the field. I think seeing different ways of doing that, including managing land differently to produce multiple benefits from the same piece of land, becomes a bit more complicated. But once people can be led down that path, I think there'll be benefits for all of them.
Great, thanks, Harry. And finally, I'm going to turn to Archie and ask the same question. Archie, what do you think is the most important thing that needs to happen now?
First I'll say I don't disagree with anything that the other panelists have said, and certainly we've taken an approach that is sort of learn by doing and trying to show people, and we've taken a very open approach to the work we've done on the farm so far, and and that's been very valuable for us to both learn from others that have come around and interject their ideas into what we've been doing. But I think there are some more structural things that need to happen to make make the whole system work more effectively. And the first is to build the evidence base for environmental projects. I mean, I've been involved in the environmental world most of my working life, and the times I've seen the sort of monitoring evaluation side of projects be dropped due to lack of funds is now coming back to haunt us, because we don't know what the evidence base for natural flood management is. We don't know what the evidence base for wetland creation in terms of the beaver project we're doing. So we're having to do that work now, when really we should have that evidence base available to us. And this feeds into a baseline. I think there needs to be a baseline sub-regional scale UK natural capital appraisal. So the government needs to lead on creating the first go at having a natural capital appraisal, so that we don't all have to do it on our farms. That would lead into some harmonisation of the natural capital approaches, because, I mean, although there are some certain similarities between what we've done on our estate and what Jason's done with his, there are subtle differences. And I think we do need to start getting to a point where not only do we understand what we're all talking about in terms of the description of the assets, the description of the ecosystem services, but we also need to understand that actually there are only a finite set of choices to make within how do you pick out the benefits, how do you identify them, but then how also, what algorithms do you put in place to then value them. And these are all discussions that are getting in the way at the moment of, the chat box, the Q&A is full of, how did you value this? How did you value that? And these are things that they're very valid questions, and they're things that I've been asking Atkins, whereas we've been working through this, the team at Atkins. But there are some choices to be made, and we're confident in the choices that we've made in terms of how we've approached it, but then it won't necessarily be the same for everybody. So we do need some consistency, and those people that are potentially in the buyer's end of this need to understand that what we're offering is the same as what our neighbours are offering, is the same as what an upland farm in the southwest is offering in terms of the way we've approached it. And this then finally comes into, it sort of speaks to a little bit to what Oliver said in his introduction, is that the financial industry needs to be very clear as to how they are anticipating the risks and the opportunities inherent with changing land use like this. Oliver spoke, a lot about the revenue side of things and the lending based on being able to monetize these things, but there is a risk element too. Our underlying assets are potentially at risk, and what we've done is try to expose some of that risk and then identify it so that we can do something about it. But in terms of in other parts of Europe, the financial sector is actually lending based on a reduction in risk, different rates based on the fact that you're managing your soil in a particular way. Is this something that can come to the UK? That's looking not only at the revenue streams that are available, but also the underlying asset management and the way you're sort of stewarding your biggest asset in some ways. So I think those are the things really. But I would echo the call I take a slightly more robust approach perhaps than Harry does. I think you should just get on with it. And if you open your doors, people will come and help you, as they have done in droves for us.
Great, good to know. Thanks, Archie. Okay, so we now have some time to answer some of your questions. Thank you very much. We've had quite a few in already, so bear with us. And if everyone could just turn their videos on, we will start with the first question. So this comes from Andrew Sabir. I'm an organic farmer in the Peak District National Park. Judging by the evidence of recent weeks, national parks are already seen by people in this country as a public good. Public goods which are in private ownership, such as footpaths, woodlands, and iconic landscapes, will be reliant on privately owned farmland. Is this accepted as a public good, and does it form part of the ELMS payments? If we could go to Harry first on that one.
Yeah, I'll have a go. I mean, I think in some ways the discussion about public goods, which was in some way instigated by the government's use of that phrase when it was sort of revealing its ELMS policy, it's moved the discussion on about natural capital in some ways, but also added perhaps a layer of confusion as to what we then mean by a public and private good. I think as the CLA, when we're thinking about natural capital, we think that, the way you manage land and the environmental benefits or avoided risks that can produce a whole range of benefits, public and private. Some benefits to the landowner, who are protecting their assets, some that could be sold to buyers within environmental markets. And then there are the public goods, which are available to the whole of society. And I think where you draw the line is a big question. I think that things like access to the outdoors, which I think is what the question is asking about, that's probably quite a pure public good in most situations, as in it would be paid for by the government and available to everyone. Obviously, in some instances, you might charge people to come onto your land. And I mentioned green prescriptions. I mean, somebody could set up a piece of outdoor space particularly designed for people to improve their mental well-being, for example, and invite small groups of people on for that reason. So, there are ways of being paid for this. And the CLA's view on public access is always that this should be sort of voluntary and incentivized, so that, in most situations, you shouldn't, if you receive public money, it shouldn't be a matter of course that you then receive the public as well. But if you do, you should be incentivized to pay some of the costs of that in most situations.
Okay, thanks, Harry. Archie, yes, do you want to come in?
I'd just like to, from a landowner's perspective, I mean, we enjoy having the public on the estate, but I think the difference between a pure public good and the provision of something like access is that there are costs associated with it. So the risk assessments that we carry out for all our public footpaths and some permissive paths that we make available and some horse rides that we do, there is a cost to that, there is a liability to that. So whilst we don't necessarily derive a huge amount of income from it, and we certainly derive no income from a lot of it, it's something that we value. And one thing we haven't talked about in this at all is social capital. This is another one of the 5 capitals that you can look at. I think the Elm scheme's got to recognise, and I think it probably will recognise to some degree, the costs associated with the provision of some of these public goods. But equally, we also, as landowners, have to recognise the intrinsic social value and the social capital that we may be accruing in order to provide these. And there is a trade-off there, because some of the benefits do accrue back to us.
Okay, thanks, Archie. I'm going to turn to a question from David Hill. And actually, I'm going to come to you, Archie. It's, do you think that we are anywhere near a universally accepted range of financial figures for the provision of natural capital services? How important do you think that is? And are we looking at this the wrong way by making it a financial transaction? Are there more important things going on? Valuation figures are going to become increasingly important.
Thanks, Anne. There's a few moves to try and harmonise this. There's development of British standards for natural capital corporate accounts. There's development of British standard for biodiversity net gain calculations. I don't think it's ever going to be possible to put one single price on any one particular ecosystem service across a range of landscapes and locations. I think the beauty of natural capital and ecosystem services is that it is hyper-local. So therefore, the approach to valuation should, I absolutely agree, be harmonised. I believe the Natural Capital Committee put in their recent report a call for the ONS to publish some standardised frameworks for this, which I would entirely support. But I think the beauty of what we're doing here is that every piece of land can produce a different array of ecosystem services, and those have a different value within the local, national and international frameworks. So, to say that, a B is worth X here is worth X everywhere else is not an approach that I think can work. In terms of what, there are more important things going on, I'm not quite sure what that element refers to, but I think this feeds into, how do I manage my 6-metre margin to contribute to local flooding, national biodiversity targets and international carbon sequestration, climate change, climate crisis risks. So I think there's always a layered approach to this, and I think the importance of it always comes down to a very small scale as to how you deliver that.
Thanks. Oliver, do you want to add anything to that?
Busy pressing buttons. Yeah, Archie brought up a really good point about how banks are operating, not just in Europe but around the world, and how they're evaluating risk. We've had a number of conversations with some of our valuers, about as the emphasis increases on natural capital, and whether that's for public access, whether it's carbon sequestration, organic matter in soil, whatever it is, how is that going to affect the valuation of that particular piece of land in future? And the more emphasis that's put on natural capital and biodiversity, it will increase the value of that land. We've all known farms that have come up for sale, perhaps a little run down, not drained, perhaps, that don't make as much as the farm next door that has been drained in that world. I think for us, valuations will alter their aspect, as you will, of the way they're viewing it. I think natural capital will become something that increases the value of land over time. And why I'm talking about that in relation to Archie's question about how does the bank view risk? Well, there is always a risk. If you lend money to people, as everybody on this webinar will know, if you lend money to someone, there's a chance you might not get it back. Banking is a risk and reward business. If we can see that asset base is, managed in line with current policies, it's got great biodiversity, it's been taken into account in the valuation, and increase that valuation, to us, the risk is reduced. Therefore, you will get a lower margin and a lower fee when that sort of thing comes into play. And I don't think we're decades off that. I think we're 2 or 3 or 4 years off seeing that, because, what we do need to do is, like today, we all need to come together. We all need to think about this and work a way forward for the industry.
Thanks, Oliver. Archie, and then Jason, did you want to come in on this one?
Just a quick one in response to Oliver there. I think the key thing for me is understanding how do we then measure that and report that, because a lot of the metrics that we're trying to deploy on the estate, in terms of land management, are still developing. So soil condition is a hot topic, and there's a huge amount of disagreement as to how do you measure it. And I think the key thing for me is that not only how do we measure it, but which bits do we measure? So which bits are our responsibility? And then when we start interacting with the supply chain, with international carbon targets, for example, where do the scope boundaries sit? So if we're looking at, Barclays looking at its own carbon footprint, for example, and coming to me as a landowner and say, can you offset some of this? How much of that is mine? How much of it is yours? How do I have to be a carbon neutral business in order to enter the offsets market? Because otherwise, isn't there a trade-off there? Am I providing offsets when actually I'm still emitting myself? Shouldn't I be internalizing some of those offsets? So is there a conversation there around scope in the same way that we have scope in the carbon markets, the scope in the natural capital markets? Is this something that bigger, larger, multinational organizations are looking at?
Thanks. Jason, finally.
Archie's points were spot on just then, and it can appear really complicated. I really like what the Natural Capital Committee says, because normally they try and simplify things, and one of the points they keep coming back to is, if you try and measure everything to 100%, we're never going to do anything. So just accept that there are some unknowns, and do your best. And in terms of metrics that exist at the moment, I think we've got 2 or 3 really good ones. The Woodland Carbon Code is really sophisticated in terms of woodland carbon. Archie's entirely right. Soil carbon is much more complicated and much more contested. But on woodland, I think we've got probably a world-leading code that we can use, and probably something similar developing on peatland as well. And if you want to get involved in, I suppose, the higher tiers of elms that are going to develop, they've talked about it being 3 tiers, with the 3rd tier being something where you offer a bespoke approach to DEFRA and negotiate an agreement. We don't quite know what DEFRA wants yet, but if, as Archie says, we've got a British standard, then you're going to be in a much better position to negotiate with DEFRA, as long as they're very clear on what they expect in the kind of assessments that you need to support an application.
Thanks, Jason. I'm going to move on. I'm going to take a couple of questions together and put these ones to Harry. So Will Bond has coming in to ask, how do you calculate the value of public goods? And alongside that, Lloyd McKinley, how do you actually monetize the natural capital on your land? How and where is the cash generated from?
I mean, I think, yeah, I can start by picking up where Jason left off a bit. That I think there's a lot of value at the moment, while this is still quite new, to doing the quite technical calculations to look at what benefits are generated from different types of land management on different types of land, quantifying it and trying to put values on it. I don't necessarily think that needs to happen for every single person who wants to benefit financially from managing the natural capital well, or from having natural capital. I think that there are sort of proxies and shortcuts that can be used. And the other thing to say is that this will operate both in the private and public sectors as a market. So, you know, from the government's point of view, something the CLA has been pushing is that it is useful to know the value of the public goods they want to pay for, but they also need to know, you know, what value or what price for delivering them a farmer or land manager would accept. And, you know, history has shown in the past that the government has created schemes that no one wants to go into because they don't pay enough money. So, you know, that's a factor to bear in mind. And in the private sector, I think that will be even more the case, that prices will partly be about the underlying value of something, but they'll also be about supply and demand, about who is more efficient at delivering ecosystem services and the benefits of natural capital. And in terms of monetizing it, I think that, going back to one of the slides I showed, I think that there are a lot of options for monetizing different elements of natural capital. So, you know, you can go at, you can rely on some government funding, or some, you know, the markets that are being developed by the government, and carbon might move in that direction as well, where it might become relatively easy to sell carbon credits because they have these standards. I think for the more local ones that Archie's talked about, it might be a matter of going to people in the surrounding area who are inherently benefiting from the way you're managing your natural capital, and seeking payment by demonstrating the benefits you're providing them or the risk that you're mitigating. And I think that brings on to a very important element, which is the ability to stack these different benefits and to get paid, not paid for the same thing twice, but paid for different outcomes by different people, potentially on the same piece of land. So if you create a woodland, you could get paid partly by for your carbon credits, but you could also get paid by a different source for biodiversity benefits, potentially from the government, to manage that woodland for wildlife, and you could get paid for the flood risk benefits that woodland or trees provide, potentially for a different source. So I think that's going to be really important in fitting all this together, and people, you know, so there'll be, depending on how proactive and how much risk people are willing to take, there are different ways to go out and look for this, or to wait for it to come in some instances.
Thanks, Harry. Talking about payments and how you might be paid in the future, Ian Gold has come in with an interesting point of when do the panel realistically think that elms will now be delivered, as it is becoming increasingly clear that the stated timeline will be unachievable, and can farmers really afford to wait for elms if it could be a good 5 years away or more? Harry, do you want to start with that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's possible the timeline might be delayed a little bit due to the current situation, but we're hoping that things will stay broadly on track. I think it's always had quite a long lead-in time. It's not going to be available. It wasn't planned to be available until 2024, the end of 2024. We're hoping that's still the case, but it would of course always have taken some time for it to be up and running anyway. I think, no, people shouldn't necessarily be waiting for elms. I think that there's lots that people can do in the meantime to prepare for that particular government form of funding, whether that's going into existing government schemes now, starting to think about the value of their land and the way they might want to manage it, or seeking other sources of funding, in the knowledge that elm will be in place at some point and will provide one funding stream.
Thanks. Jason, would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, I agree 100% with Harry. And the other thing to remember about elms is it's not going to fully replace the payments and the profits that we made from basic payments. So don't think that it will, even though the budget might be the same. You know, we got 80–90% profit levels from BPS we're going to get 10 to 20% profit levels from elms. And Harry's right, there are other things you can start doing now if you're interested in things like woodland creation, or if you've got other habitats that could be restored. And also don't forget emerging policies like biodiversity net gain, which will be an opportunity for some.
Thank you. And I've got time for one final question. This comes from Alex Ortwell, and it's to all the panel. There is a lot of information and discussions going on in respect of natural capital by various organisations, which highlights the need for a collaborative approach. What is the panel's view on this, and who or how can this happen to ensure everyone is on the same page? So Archie, can I start with you?
I mean, I can speak for our own, for the approach that I've taken, which is to, as landowner with a majority tenanted farm, I have taken the lead on this and tried to produce or help produce the first natural capital appraisal based around certain areas of our farm. And I think that's probably, I mean, it seems to be working okay. I mean, the tenants, my tenants have been very open with the information they've shared and are very supportive and very interested. And I'm going to go back to them and try and talk to them, and we'll try and understand how we can deliver some of this and perhaps deliver more. I think on a broader scale, in terms of working with people like the Rivers Trust, catchment partnerships, local nature partnerships, cluster farms, you know, there's a lot of value to be had from aggregating up, because any one holding, almost regardless of size, until you are the biggest holdings out there, you cannot deliver as much natural capital value and certainly as many ecosystem service benefits on your own as you can in partnership with your neighbours. So, you know, that's something that we're going to be actively pursuing, but equally, I think it's something for everyone to think about. You can make a start on your own, but I think you have to go in and talk to your neighbours as well.
Thanks. And Jason?
I agree. It feels like there's a role for much more local delivery. I don't really have an answer on who that is. You know, local authorities are probably going to have a role in terms of biodiversity net gain, for example. And we've got nature recovery networks being developed. So it feels like there's going to be more local delivery, but quite by whom, yeah, is unclear at the moment.
Okay. Oliver?
Thanks, Anne. It's, you know, at risk of being repetitive and actually folding in something Harry and Jason have already touched on, I think the answer is to be quite proactive, to reach out. You know, catchment sensitive farming schemes were, you know, would be no good if only one farmer in that catchment was working. And the bigger offering you can have, the more intriguing it is to those interested parties. But overall, you know, as a bank, we do an awful lot of our lending against the management. And I've got a lovely Chinese proverb that is, a hungry man will stand on a hillside a long time with his mouth open, waiting for a duck to fly in. You know, be proactive, get out there, start talking to these groups, talk to Jason, talk to Archie, talk to Harry, you know, and get in amongst it, because that's the sort of actions we like to see.
Thanks. And finally, Harry.
Yeah, I think I'd agree that certainly with what Archie said, that, you know, working together with neighbours will obviously be useful. I think that there's a lot that you can do on your own, but to deliver at real scale, and some of the sort of further down the road corporate investment is only going to work if it's at a quite large scale, which individual holdings are unlikely to be able to deliver without some kind of aggregation or brokering. I think that collaborating on standards is really important. And I think that's not just between different sort of people who might be working on different standards, but also between these different markets or different elements of natural capital, that you don't want to end up with a situation where the way you're being encouraged to deliver carbon is incompatible with the way you're being encouraged to deliver biodiversity net gain, which is incompatible with how you can sign into a government's environmental land management contract. So there needs to be an understanding across all the different people working in this area about what other people are doing, so that, because after all, we are talking about land as the basic element of this, and it could be used to deliver quite a lot of different things. So I think that needs to be designed in from the beginning.
Okay, thank you everyone. And that is the end of questions, unfortunately. Thank you to all the panel for your contribution today, and also to the audience for some excellent questions. We've had an astonishing amount of questions in, and I'm sorry we just didn't have time to get to all of them. However, they are being sent to all of the panelists who will answer these after the webinar is finished. From what I could hear, it's all about consistency, collaboration, and being proactive. I would direct you to the CLA guidance note that is available on our website, Natural Capital, Public Goods and Environmental Markets, which will be an interesting introduction and discussion on the subject. Coming up next, we have in our webinar series, the Forestry Update next Thursday, but tomorrow do join us for the In Conversation with our President Mark Bridgman, who will be talking to Jake Fines, who's Head of Conservation at Holcombe Estate. So thank you all once again. Have a good day, and we will see you again soon.